Last week, we started our series on 1 Samuel called Kings and Prophets. This week, we're continuing that series. It's the book of Samuel, and the book of Samuel is all about the rise of Israel's first king, Saul, and his fall, as well as the rise of David, who is the great-grandson of Ruth. Now, if you remember, Ruth is the book of the Bible that we just studied. So we just came out of that, and now we're seeing what happens to Ruth's great-grandson. How does this all play out? There's another main character in this book, including Saul and David. It's also the prophet Samuel, who guides both Saul and David as they are kings and as they lead the people in Israel. Now, last week we did like an introduction of the book. We looked at the first chapter, who introduces this character named Hannah. Now, Hannah is this woman who's in immense pain and suffering, right? Because she's unable to live up to her culture's expectation of worth and value. Now, in that particular culture, she wasn't able to have a baby. In our particular culture, that's not what we define all things by, right? It's still painful, still hard. That's not what we define all things by, but every culture has some sort of standard of worth and value that we sort of like say all people need to live up to this, right? Sometimes it's looks. Sometimes it's earning potential. Sometimes it's the amount of degrees you have or what your house looks like. But during Hannah's time, it was all about having children, and she couldn't have them. She couldn't live up to the cultural system that said that would make her valuable. And so as we looked last week, in this moment of grief and pain and sadness, she actually cries out to God, and she prays this God-centered prayer. She switches her prayer from, God, give me a son for me and my purposes, and she switches it to this prayer that says, God, give me a son for you and your purposes. And God hears her prayer, and he honors it. She becomes pregnant, and she gives birth to Samuel, who she then is very faithful to. She gives him back to God by bringing him to the temple to serve God in his temple, okay? Now, in response to all that God has done, Hannah gives this beautiful prayer and praise. And I'm going to read a few verses from it. But I need you to know that as we read this prayer of praise actually highlights the themes for the rest of the book. It sort of operates like this prologue so that everyone knows, like, hey, pay attention to these themes as we continue in this story. As we hear all the other stories, here's going to be the themes, all right? So let's read. It's verses 1. If you're following along in your Bible, you can open up your Bible, open up your app, whatever. If you're following along, we are skipping around just a bit. You can read the whole thing later if you want. But it's verse 1. It's Samuel chapter 2, verse 1, 4 and 5, and then 10. All right, so that's where we're going. All right, so here we go. My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord, my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I dwell in your deliverance. The bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumble are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who were hungry, they hunger no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has had many sons pines away. It is not by strength that one prevails. Those who oppose the Lord will be broken. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. Okay, so now, if you're not a poetry person, you're like, I don't see themes. I don't know. That's okay. I'm going to point them out for you. Here's 3 of the themes that are going to come up throughout the rest of the book. 1, God opposes the proud and exalts the humble. You'll see this over and over and over again in the story. God opposes the proud and he exalts the humble, right? It's like, hey, the strong people aren't going to be the ones who win here. The warriors, their bows are going to be broken, right? Points it out. The next one is, despite human evil, God is at work. And we saw that throughout the book of Ruth too. Despite human evil, God's at work and God is faithful. The third thing is, God will raise up a messianic king that will rule forever. Okay? So those are the themes we're going to see for the rest of our series on kings and prophets, on the first book of Samuel. Now, the way that this book works is that Hannah actually becomes this model for what it looks like to be humble rather than proud, and to trust God's faithfulness and him as king, right? Hannah sort of becomes the person who models this. Everybody else is messing it up, but Hannah becomes the person that models this is what it looks like. It's her prayer and her praise sort of sets the stage to how we should posture ourselves and our life in humility and not in arrogance, in faithfulness and to God, and submission to God alone as king and as the coming king. Now, in contrast, we're going to see all of these other stories that are going to come up in the rest of the book that display like arrogance and distrust and human impulsivity to force fit their own solutions. But Hannah sort of is the model for this is the posture we are actually supposed to take. And Samuel, as her offspring, becomes this representative of Hannah's posture to all of Israel and to us through the rest of the story. So as Samuel steps into this role as prophet and leader, he becomes this representative of Hannah being in this posture of humility and trusting God's faithfulness for the rest of the book. And both Hannah and Samuel's posture stand in stark contrast to the rest of the nation of Israel, including some of the priests that Samuel winds up serving alongside, right? Samuel goes to the temple, and we quickly learn that Eli, who's like one of the head priests that Hannah interacted with earlier in the last chapter, right? Eli has these two sons, Hophni and Phinehas. Not Phineas and Ferb, Phinehas, right? Hophni and Phinehas. That have not taken a posture of humility, but instead are sort of taking advantage of their position. They're sort of seeing the things, the splendors of being a priest and reaping them for their own harvest. They're taking things that don't belong to them. They're using their position for their own gratification, their own gain, and not for God's purposes. And as a result, God's like, Eli, I hate your family. You suck, and you're going to be cut off from this priestly line. Like, I am rejecting you and your entire household because your sons are no good. And we find out in chapter 3, God has pretty much stopped speaking to the priests and revealing himself to anyone in Israel because of this whole thing that has been going on. But then we're given the story of God revealing himself to Samuel, calling Samuel by name, choosing Samuel. And God slowly begins to use Samuel to speak to the entire nation of Israel. And this is where the story we're looking at today picks up. It's the story of how God raises up Samuel and uses him to call Israel out of their pride into a posture of humility. Now, the reality is humility is not easy for any of us. It's actually a really difficult tightrope to walk because oftentimes when we think we're being humble, we're actually being like self-deprecating. We're like, I'm a worm, I am nothing, right? We think we're being humble and we're actually just trading one form of arrogance to another. Humility is actually agreeing with God about who we are, about who he says we are. And so arrogance can look like I'm the best and better than everybody else. It can also look like I am nothing, right? Neither one of those are humility. Neither one of those are agreeing with God about who we are. When we agree with God about who we are, we recognize that we are his children, that we are dearly loved. We're his inheritance. We are beloved. Like this is a big deal. And so the nation of Israel, they don't get it. We struggle with humility. They're going to struggle with humility. And we're going to walk through the story with them. Now, as a heads up, I am going to try to get through 6 chapters of 1 Samuel. And as I was preparing for this, I realized that this was like a really important and timely message for our particular congregation, I think. But I know that if I take too long getting through all 6 of these chapters, I'm going to lose you, and you're going to be asleep, and you're going to miss like the big reveal, okay? So I have been working really hard to try to condense it. So if you're like, well, you cut out some corner, I'm like, yes, I did. I know, you're right, I did. But I'm going to tell you the Beth Cliff Notes version of this story so that we can get through it, okay? And we can see how God reveals himself at the end and what we're being called to. Okay, ready? So you remember how the Israelites were set free from slavery, right? And the Egyptians were conquered, and God led them to the promised land, right? We all remember that. Great, we're there. We're in the promised land. They settle there. But there are these other nations all around them that basically keep picking on them. Every once in a while, they get a little uppity, and they invade Israel, and they try to, take things from them and steal things and take their people and all this sort of stuff. And it's really annoying, and every once in a while, God is like, all right, arm up. We're going to protect the people. We're going to protect the barriers and boundaries of the promised land. God shows up and he protects his people and he fights for them in these miraculous ways, which is awesome. God is crazy, the things he does. It's nuts. Now, while Eli and his awesome sons were still priests and in charge, God is talking to Samuel, but Samuel's not leading yet. In the middle of this whole time, there's one of the neighboring groups, the Philistines, that gets a little uppity and they start attacking Israel. They start going after the Israelites. So the Israelites suit up and they think, great, God's with us. He's defended us before. He's going to defend us again. And so they go to battle against the Philistines. But they lose. I mean, they don't just lose a little, they are decimated. They lose a lot. And so they retreat and they hunker back, and the elders of Israel come together and they're like, what happened? What happened? What's up with this? And one of the elders gets this great idea. He says this in chapter 4, verse 3. He says, let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, the place where all the sacrifices were done and sort of the temple was. Let us bring the ark of not the temple, but the tabernacle was, the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh, so that it may come among us and save us from the hands of our enemies. Now, if you've seen Indiana Jones, you know the ark of the covenant. That joke was for you. He was like, make sure you mention Indiana Jones, okay? It was a comment. It was colorful commentary. So in Indiana Jones, they have the Ark of the Covenant. It opens up and everybody's face gets melted off. You know what I'm talking about? Nobody knows that reference. Thank you. That's a great reference. Okay. So the Ark of the Covenant didn't really melt people's face off. That was not true. But it was this little golden box. It was this box that it was carried by the priests with a set of poles. When God made a covenant with Moses and the people of God, God commanded that this golden box be made and that the tablets that contained the covenant be set into the box. It had a couple different artifacts in it, but it was set into the box. And then there were these gold-winged creatures, these cherubim, that were adorned on top of the box. And the box was used as this visible sign of God's holy presence. It was sort of like this understanding that God dwells among us. Now, God didn't really dwell in that box or on top of the box, which was called the glory seat, but it was sort of like the representative of God's presence here in this place. Now, the reality is that there had been battles where the presence of the Ark of the Covenant played a significant role in the Israelites winning the battle. For example, the Battle of Jericho, right? The big walls, they hike around it 7 times. They carry the Ark of the Covenant. They blow the trumpets and the walls come tumbling down, right? So there had been times where God had said, hey, bring the Ark of the Covenant with you and it will help you win the battle. We're going to do this together. But in this case, God did not tell them to bring the ark. And notice that when in that last verse, let's look at it again, look what they say. They say, let us bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that the ark, it may come among us and save us from the hand of our enemies. There's sort of this understanding in their thinking that they're not saying so that God may save us, so that the presence of God may save us. They're treating the ark as a thing, as this token, as this magical trinket that if they have the possession over, they can control God and get him to do whatever it is they want. So instead of taking this posture of humility like Hannah did and praying this God-centered prayer, they actually replaced God's power with this tool that had been used by God in the past. Instead of seeking sort of a fresh revelation from God and saying, hey, I'm going to trust your faithfulness that you're going to deliver us, they say, well, I don't have time for that. Instead, I'm going to look back on what worked in the past, and we're going to go with that. Whatever the last thing was that saved us, we'll go to that again. And the last time it was the Ark of the Covenant, so we'll just bring that out. So Hophni and Phinehas, they bring the ark. And then in chapter 4, verse 5, they say that when the ark of the Lord's covenant came into the camp, all of Israel started singing, we've got the power. No, down, down, down. I'm glad that my daughter laughed at my dancing. It's a good ego trip right there. Right? They start singing, we got the power. No, what they do is all of Israel raised such a shout that the ground shook, which was basically the same thing as them saying, we've got the power. Why did they shout? They shouted because that's what you were supposed to do. In many accounts of previous battles, there would be, the ark would arrive, and then this loud noise would go up, and then boom, they'd win the battle. So here's what they're doing. They brought the trinket, the magic trinket, and then they're following the formula to make the loud noise. And boom, enemy vanquished. They thought they could control God. They thought that there's a formula to get God to move in a certain way. And the Philistines hear this noise, and they have heard stories about this God of the Israelites who set them free from the Egyptians, and they're scared. They're like, oh my gosh, we're gonna lose. But they head to battle, and surprise, surprise, the Philistines fight, and the Philistines win. And once again, the Israelites aren't just defeated, they are demolished, and they run for the hills. And in the process of this retreat, the Ark of the Covenant is captured. And Hophni and Phinehas, they die. And then when Eli, their father, hears about their death and the capture of the ark, he's so distraught, he falls off his stool and dies, right? Like everybody dies. It's awful. And all of Israel is plunged into despair, thinking that our God, the ark, has been captured, and there's no hope for us. We are all worms. We're the worst. Now, even though we don't have an Ark of the Covenant, we just have a TV that's not working. Even though we don't have an Ark of the Covenant, there are a lot of ways that we try to march into battle, and we bring all sorts of God boxes with us. Right? There's all sorts of ways that we have in the past, or we've seen people use different God boxes to try to manipulate different students, different people, and get God to do a certain thing. Now, my classic example of this was before I pastored here, I was a pastor for middle school and high school students in student ministry. And when I first took that position, I will never forget my first middle school retreat. Never forget it. We went with another church because I only had a few students and I was still real green and didn't know what in the world I was doing. And so I just showed up with my 11 students and just said here we go, let's try this. And the other church had done all the programming, which I was like, that's great. I don't know how to do any of that. Let's go. So we show up, and I'm meeting the other leaders, and we're talking about what's going to happen. And then they say, hey, and then Sunday night, that'll be cry night. And everyone's like, yes, cry night. Yes, cry night. And I was like, what's cry night? What is cry night? And they started to explain, after 2 jam-packed days of crazy activities and the kids not sleeping very well at night, all of the kids are on the emotional brink. So all we have to do is turn the lights down, play this song, and this song, and then we just say these words and we pray for them, and then they all they just bawl their eyes out and they surrender, and boom, everyone's giving their heart to the Lord. That is cry night. It's beautiful. And I remember just sitting there thinking, that sounds really manipulative. That sounds really, really manipulative. But there was this understanding that if we dim the lights in this way, if we play these songs, if we say these words, then that's the God box, and we can control God and make him move in these certain ways, and there's this atmosphere and this lighting, and that's how we get God to show up. Guys, we got a lot of God boxes. We got a lot of God boxes. We got a lot of things that we use in order to try to be like, if I do this formula, then God's going to show up. And it happens in all sorts of different ways in our lives. We do it with the atmosphere and the lighting and the mood sometimes. We do it with like, this is the author of this devotional, and every time I do this person's devotional, it happens, right? That's my God box. That's how God works. We sometimes think that if we tithe enough, that then if I can just give enough, then like maybe God will give me a husband. Like that's my God box. That's how that will work. Or we think, gosh, if I just don't have sex until after I get married, then I will have a good marriage for the rest of my life. Everything will be set. That is my God box. Or sometimes guilt gets used as this God box, that if I just lay the guilt on real thick, God will move in your heart and you will no longer do that thing that I don't want you to do. God will show up in your life. God cannot be controlled. God is too hot to handle. God cannot be contained in a box. We cannot possess him. We can't play a certain formula and boom, he shows up. He can't be owned, manipulated, controlled, or used. We can never shrink God down into a box or create a formula that we can use to make him work in a certain way. He's too big. He's too untainable. And when we try, every time, it backfires. So Israel gets demolished. I mean, the army gets just, lots of people die. Ark of the Covenant gets stolen. The Philistines are like, oh, we got the God box. We got the Ark of the Covenant. We got the power. I won't dance again. I had to plan to dance through this whole thing and sing the song every time, but I'll just say it. We got the power. We have the God box now. We have all the power. We control their God. And so they set the God box up in the temple of their God, Dagon, which I thought was a funny name. I'm like, is that where that came from? Dagon, whatever. But when they return to Dagon's temple the next day, they actually find like Dagon is chopped up in little pieces. Like they're like, whoa, what happened to our like statue? What happened? It's fallen on the floor. It's chopped up in little pieces. And then what happens is everybody in the city starts to get sick. And so the Philistines start playing hot potato with this Ark of the Covenant. They keep passing it around from city to city. And every city that the Ark of the Covenant goes to, all of the people wind up getting sick. And they're like, oh, we don't want it. No, we don't want it. No, we don't want it, right? God is too hot to handle. They can't control it. They can't hold on to the power of God. And so they keep trying to get rid of it until the point they're like, send it back. We don't want it anymore. So they put it on this cart. They put 2 milk cows on the cart, and they fill the cart up with gold, and they smack the cow's butt and say, go. And the cow, wanders, the 2 cows wander down the road back into Israel territory, into a town called Beth Shemesh. Now, they're like, we can't control that God either. But now as it's strolling into town, the Israelites in Beth Shemesh start gloating. Hey, look what we got. We got the ark. Check us out. We got the power. But then God is like, OMG, are you kidding me? You guys do not get it. Did you like that joke? I thought of that and I was like, oh, this is going to be good, okay? You don't have anything. I got the power. God alone has the power. You can't own him. You can't control him. And immediately 70 men in Beth Shemesh are struck down dead. And they're like, shoot, we can't control this either. And so they send the ark away to this remote village up in the hilltop country, thinking, okay, just get it out. We'll just send it away. We just can't deal with it. And it stays there hidden away for 20 years. Okay. They thought that the ark, the God box, was the problem. So they mistakenly think that if they remove it from the equation, then everything's going to improve. Now here's the deal. Sometimes when we realize the ways that we have created God-sized boxes or God boxes, we try to send them away. We say, oh shoot, let's not have cry night. Like, let's keep the lights bright and all the lights on. Let's make sure there's no emotional feeling in any of the music, because we've seen how that's been used to manipulate, so we're going to root that out. I'm not going to do devotionals with my family anymore because that's just become trite and formulaic and like whatever, so like let's root that out, right? Whatever the God box is, we say, let me just send it away and that will solve the problem. Now, knowing many of you and knowing some of your story, you're in this congregation because you've actually seen God boxes be used manipulatively, and you're like, I don't want to deal with that anymore. The number of people who have come from working on previous church staffs or been in high levels church leadership and are now here and going to seminary and been burned and all of those different things, like you're here because a lot of that you're just like, I am sick and tired of that. Like, I just want to get back to something where we're not using the God box anymore. You sent the God box away a long time ago, and you just kind of said, let's not use that God box anymore. And that's really good. That's good. You recognize that like the God box wasn't a good idea. But I think that one of the things we've done is we've just sent the God box away, and sometimes our relationship with God with it. I think sometimes what happens is as we mature and grow in our faith, we start this process of deconstruction, which I know means 100 different things to 100 different people. And so this is the version of it that I am thinking of when I'm talking about it today. I think sometimes when we're handed our faith, it's kind of like our ancestors, parents, elders, churches that we've been a part of have gifted us a car. And they've loaded it with tons of different baggage, like lots of luggage. Like it is, what's that? Beverly Hillbillies, thank you. This is my like, we got a connection, right? It's like loaded down with all of this stuff, and it's handed to us like, hey, here you go. And there's this process of us owning our own faith where all of us have to kind of like start to deconstruct that. We have to like start taking out the God boxes we've been handed to say, hey, here's the formulaic way that this works. We have to start taking it off and opening it up and being like, oh, this is a whole bunch of garbage. Like, throw that out, right? We have to go through all of that baggage and all of that luggage, and we have to figure out. But sometimes in the process of doing that, we can grow with so much cynicism about all the baggage that we've been handed, that we just kind of ship the car with all of its contents off to the hills and say, I'm just not even going to touch it. I don't even want to deal with it anymore. I'll just walk for the rest of my life. I don't want to deal with that. There's sort of this lack of humility that's willing to go through the luggage and really figure out, God, where are you in the midst of all of this? Who are you really? And this is where I think a lot of us struggle. I think some of us are still struggling with the God boxes, but generally I think a lot of us are struggling with this thing where we've shipped the God boxes off, but we like won't engage in it for 20 years. We're like, I just don't even want to deal with, like I can't. And so maybe we come to church and we're trying to figure it out, and we know what we don't want our faith to look like, but we haven't quite humbled ourselves enough to do the work to figure out what our faith does need to look like. To figure out what does it look like for us to actually have a relationship with God that is not dependent on a God box, on a formulaic thing, but actually is dependent on listening to God. That is actually dependent on like getting down on our face and our knees every day, not in a formulaic way, but in a way of full surrender, saying, God, You've got to guide me. Like, this is not my show. This is not my battle. This is you and you alone. So please come, lead me, Holy Spirit, lead me, guide me, direct me, send me into this world, right? A lot of us are so worried that that might even become a God box that we're like, well, I don't want to even do that. And God's like, yeah, but then you're missing out. And so for Israel, even though they threw away their God box, their situation didn't actually improve. Not for 20 years. Not until 20 years later, we're told in chapter 7, verse 2, that then all of the people of Israel turned back to the Lord. right? Now, I don't know what prompted this. I don't know. It just all of a sudden says the box went away for 20 years, and then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord after that. They lamented to the Lord for what they had done. They had this change of heart. They didn't just want to win. They didn't just want power. They just didn't want control. They actually wanted the Lord. That is a totally different thing. And so Samuel comes, and we're told in chapter 7, verse 3 and 4. So Samuel said to all the Israelites, if you're returning to the Lord with all of your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Asheroths, and commit yourself to the Lord and serve him only. And he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. And so the Israelites put away their Baals and their Asheroths, and they served the Lord only. Now, just pausing here real quick. A lot of times we think, but I put away my God box. But here's what you might have done. In the process of stripping all of those things, you actually put yourself as the center, as God, to be the one who determines how God can and can't move. Can't move in that God box or that God box. And that congregation, they're a mess, and they don't know what they're doing. And you essentially set yourself up as one of the Baals and the Asherahs, the foreign god that is the one who determines all of the things. And what Samuel is calling them to do, like, humble yourself. Humble yourself. Put all that away. Serve God only, and he will deliver you. All right, so all of Israel gathers together, and they have this time of prayer and confession and sacrifice. And it's not just lip service. There's like real heart change that happens, and we know that because of what happens next. It directly contrasts everything that we heard in the previous battle 20 years ago. That when the Philistines hear that they're all gathered together having this big prayer service or whatever, they decide, let's attack again. Let's go after them. And everyone is afraid. And so they say to Samuel, do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that God may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines. That he may save us. Not it, not the box, that God may save us. There's this trust in God. There's this acknowledgement that God is the one that saves. And so Samuel prays for them, and he actually makes this sacrifice, and the Lord answers. We're told that while Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines draw near to engage Israel in the battle. But that day the Lord thundered, not the people making loud noises, the Lord thundered with loud thunder against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were rooted before the Israelites. And the Israelites win. And this time it's God that makes the noise. God's the one who defeats the Philistines. And we're told that for the rest of the time that Samuel is this leader, the Philistines don't even enter the land. Like they're like, we're out. We're done. I want to invite you that if you are in maybe that first half and you're like, no, I got a God box that I'm working with. I'm going to invite you to give that up, to humble yourself and say, wow, God, I really have been operating from this formula to try to control you and make these things work, and I see it's not working. I'm going to invite you to humble yourself in that. But also, I want to invite those of you who are like, I'm so scared of creating another God box that I'm not even engaging in a relationship with God. Like I've sent that whole thing to the hills, and I'm worried that in any way I try, it's just going to become this another formula, this another rote thing. I want to invite you to have a conversation with God today. Maybe it's really similar to the same thing that the Israelites Samuel does on behalf of Israel, where you sort of return to God and you recognize that he's the one that makes a way, that he's the one that saves us. that he's the one that fights the battles. Now, in this process, Samuel offers a sacrifice. And I want you to know that 2,000 years ago, that sacrifice was already offered. That when Jesus took on flesh and dwelled among this earth and lived as a human and became killable, he died on a cross, but then rose again. And it's because of Jesus that we are able to enter into that relationship with God. No matter where you've been or where you've gone, God has offered the sacrifice so that we can be in relationship with him. And all God is inviting us to do is sort of humble ourselves and say, yeah, I have tried to control. I have tried to manipulate. I have tried to win these battles on my own. I have even stayed far away from you because I'm worried that I might somehow get in that same God box cycle again. But here I am. I desire to humble myself today. Now, we're going to pray this prayer. Sometimes we do these posture prayers, whereas basically we just sort of set our hands in certain ways in order to make tangible what it is that our prayer is about and what we're praying and what we're feeling. And so I'm going to invite you this morning as a response to do a humility posture prayer. And it just has two really simple motions. Like, I'm not going to have you like dance or anything like that. It's just this posture of fighting, and then it's a posture of surrender. And in this prayer, we just recognize the ways that we have been fighting our own battles, that we have been trying to make this all happen on our own, that we've been trying to control and manipulate. And then we just offer a prayer of surrender, of humility, recognizing that we are not God, that God is God, and we sort of surrender to him. So I'm going to invite you to pray with me and assume that posture first of